ever happen again. I thought this was a unique event, unique to the former Soviet Union and their design of nuclear power plants, but that turns out probably not to be the case. And I guess before we can really move forward, we need to go through a very brief history of nuclear energy in the Western world. Since the beginning of time, there have been about 600 commercial nuclear power plants, and currently there are a few more than 400 that are operating in 31 countries around the world. And during this time, there have been 3 major accidents. The first in the United States at 3 Mile Island in 1979 in Pennsylvania. The second and the largest, Chernobyl in 1986. And of course, the second largest in Fukushima, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which occurred in 2011. But these aren't the only accidents. In fact, again, there have been more than 33 serious incidents or accidents at nuclear power plants since 1952, and surprisingly, we know very little about the impacts of these accidents on human health or the environment. Again, extremely surprising given that there have been all of these various accidents. So this is one reason for studying the effects of radiation. Another is that, of course, here in the United States, we're a major nuclear country with more than 100 licensed reactors in the U.S. And all of these nuclear power plants have huge stockpiles of the spent fuel, the fuel that once it's used up gets put outside of the reactor and stored in the cooling pond for a while, and then stored on site in dry storage. We have no other place to put it at this point, and so all of these stockpiles of highly radioactive material are sitting there. Again, potentially accidents waiting to happen, and we don't actually have much of an idea what the consequences might be if there were an accident related to that spent fuel. We're building new nuclear power plants all around the world. There are more than 60 under construction, most of them in China at the moment. I think there's 39 under construction in China, but we also have quite a few here in here in the United States going on. So for instance, we have in my part of the world, I live in Columbia, South Carolina, and in Columbia, South Carolina here we have 4 new reactors being built right at this point in time. One of them is 20 miles north of where I live, and the other 2 are about 60 miles to the west. And so again, given that nuclear energy is continuing for some time to come, we really need to know more about the potential consequences of what might be happening. And here are some aerial photos that of these new nuclear power plants under construction here in the U.S. This is what $12 billion looks like under construction, and of course this will bring lots of new electricity to the area. Here's the Vogel plant at the South Carolina-Georgia border. And of course you can see all these cars where all the workers are parked. This is a major, again, 12 billion plus or minus construction site. So everybody's very fond of these kinds of mega projects because they bring a lot of employment to the area, at least for some period of time. Another issue is that here in the United States in particular, we have many areas where there are lots and lots of nuclear plants, power plants, where people live. So again, here in South Carolina, where I live, we have all of these nuclear power plants with lots of people living very close by. And of course, up the eastern seaboard, we have quite a few up in this area as well. And if you live in the Chicago area, as some of you do, I think, again, we have quite a few in that region as well. And so if there were to be an accident, many people would be affected as a result of any kind of accidents. So here in South Carolina, where I live, you can see that there are actually millions of people living within 30 miles of a nuclear power plant. And so this should be of some concern in terms of what the potential impact of an accident might be. Another aspect unrelated to accidents, just related to the regular everyday operations of nuclear power plants, all of these power plants release some amount of radioactive material as a regular, normal, everyday part of their operations. Most people don't realize just how much is generated. Of course, the idea that the operators have is they dribble it out, they dilute it out in small quantities at a time so that it's never very concentrated. But again, we have very little idea of what the environmental consequences, let alone the health consequences, of this sort of continuous input of radioactive materials into the environment might be. This particular graph here is for tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen, which becomes water and gets into the ground and into the air and is easily dispersed into biological systems. Here are some other kinds of radioactive materials, again, that are released from nuclear power plants of all sorts. You'll notice from the red bars that the effluents have actually gone down quite a bit over the years, and this, of course, was based because of safety concerns of all this radioactive material being released into the environment and sort of the unknown consequences. Those of you who live in the Chicago area, here is the sort of the timeline for release of radioactive materials from the Dresden plant, again through time. You can see that in past years, back in the early days, in this region here, the amounts of radioactive materials released were considerable. They've dropped down by 1,000 to 10,000 times since the beginning of their operations, which is a good thing. Another reason for being interested in the effects of radiation in the environment stems from the fact that most of our nuclear power plants now are getting quite old, 30, 40 years old, and like any piece of machinery, as it gets old, it tends to break down or develop leaks, like your car in the driveway leaking oil or transmission fluid, the seals break, the valves start to leak. And what we noticed a few years ago was that many of the old nuclear power plants were leaking quite a bit more radioactive material into the environment than they were allowed to or that we had even known about. And when we started looking, we realized that many of these power plants, about a third to a half of them, were leaking more than they were supposed to. And so, again, with unknown consequences to the environment and health. So these are all good reasons for studying the effects of radioactivity in the environment, just so that we know what the consequences might be, and so we can be prepared for disasters that could happen unpredictably and, of course, unexpectedly. And we're unhappy when it happens, but it does every now and then. The Chernobyl disaster of April 26, 1986, the meltdown resulted in a nuclear fire that burned for 10 days, again, injecting huge amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. And depending on which way the wind was blowing, the radioactive materials were dispersed all around Europe. Most of them landed into Ukraine and Belarus, this area, but an awful lot landed into Russia. Some landed in Scandinavia, quite a bit in Scandinavia, even some into Austria and northern Italy, and even parts of Scotland were contaminated from Chernobyl to the point that the sheep couldn't be used for food or for their wool. And so, again, a major disaster, 200,000 square kilometers, significantly contaminated, an area 2.5 times the size of South Carolina. The Fukushima disaster of March 11, 2011, again, a much smaller disaster in terms of terrestrial impacts to the land, perhaps about 1/10 as large, maybe a little less than that. Of course, there's huge amounts of effluent still being released into the marine systems that we have very little knowledge of what that impact might be, although many people on the west coast of the U.S. are bracing for the movement of the radioactive water to the coastline. At this point, we have absolutely no idea what the long-term impacts might be. Everyone's hoping that the radioactivity will be diluted to the point that it has little or no effect, but this really is a large unknown. One point to note here is that, of course, in Fukushima, they actually narrowly escaped a major impact in Tokyo. The Tokyo metropolitan area, the largest metropolitan area in the world, has about 36 million people living there. Parts of northern Tokyo were actually significantly contaminated. We don't know what the impacts will be. Most of the higher levels of impacts were luckily restricted to the Fukushima Prefecture or province, where luckily not nearly as many people live, but again, still relatively unknown impacts. So my research group at the University of South Carolina has been working on the effects of Chernobyl since 2000. I've been working in partnership with my collaborator at CNRS in France, Anders Møller, and we started in 2000. And July 2011, we actually made our first visit to Japan to study the impacts of Fukushima. And most of our work is on natural populations of birds, insects, microbes, and we've made, these numbers are a little out of date. I think we've been to Chernobyl about 40 times now, and to Fukushima 14 or 15 times now. We've published an awful lot of basic scientific studies related to the effects of Chernobyl and disaster, more than 60 scientific publications so far. And a point that I always make early in my presentations is that we are independent biologists. Our primary interest is in documenting adaptation and the impacts of elevated mutation rates on population processes. We're not anti-nuclear activists per se. That's not what motivates us, although, of course, many of the anti-nuclear groups are interested in our work. Again, again, if there are questions along the way, please, you can type them in there, and I'll try and address them as we go. I'll try to pay attention to the little text box down at the bottom here. This really is an interesting technology here. Those of you who watch television and have paid attention to this whole Chernobyl issue have probably thought that, been led to believe that this Chernobyl area is actually doing great because there's a fence around it, and so the wildlife has come back and everything is hunky-dory. And actually that's what we thought when we first went there because of this kind of publicity that had been generated. But when we looked carefully, and of course, you see pictures like these horses. These are wild horses, Przewalski's horses, that are the progenitor to the modern domestic horse. They went extinct in the wild. They were kept in a few refuges in zoos and preserves around the world, but very few of them still around. And of course, they were released into the Chernobyl zone a number of years ago, where they appear to be doing okay, although we don't actually really know how well they're doing. And again, you'll see photos of wild pigs that seem to be doing just fine. One fellow living in the area has taken a bunch of photos using these cameras, these hidden cameras, and found evidence of some wildlife in the area, and even a deer every now and then. This was all surprising to us because, of course, there have been really, until we started working in the area a few years ago, very few scientific studies, at least in the Western literature, indicating that everything was, as suggested, going well in the Chernobyl zone. There was no data to support this position. And so this really motivated us to go and do the hard work of finding out what really is going on in this area. And so, like good scientists, and we hope we are, we've framed our research in terms of hypotheses and questions to be addressed. And we followed a very logical progression, starting with first, do the levels of radioactivity that we see in Chernobyl result in measurably elevated mutation rates in these natural populations? And, if there's no evidence of genetic damage, then we have nothing to worry about. Secondly, if there are mutations, are there consequences to these mutations? All of us carry around mutations in our body, most of which have no effect. They're not expressed, just part of the natural redundancy of DNA and the genetic code. And so we need to know whether or not mutations that occur, if they do, have any consequences in terms of birth defects and developmental effects and things like that. You know, we also need to know whether there are fitness consequences to these mutation rates. Are there effects on survival and reproduction or disease, susceptibility to disease? As evolutionary biologists, we're very interested in this question of, you know, is there evidence for adaptation? Do we see animals actually developing abilities or evolving abilities to deal with the radiation? And finally, you know, are there effects on population abundances and biodiversity, which of course is the theme for this week's series of webinars here. And of course, at one step above this, one level above this, are there ecosystem consequences? Does the ecosystem as a whole, has it been injured or affected in any way as a result of these radioactive contaminants? So I thought to get into the research, why don't I show a little video recently taken by the New York Times that actually gives you a better flavor of what it's like to be doing research in this area. And let's see if we can get this to work.
All right, well, it looks like a nice spider web over here. Let's see if we can't catch this on film. We missed it up a little bit. You know, what was invisible now becomes visible. Nice. Yeah, that's perfect. Yep.
And you'll notice it looks kind of normal, you know.
And being bathed in about 45 microsieverts per hour, plus or minus, which is pretty darn radioactive.
You know, at first glance, it seems like it might be relatively normal. You got plants and animals around, but it's very radioactive.
In 1986, an explosion and fire at the nuclear reactor in what was then the Soviet Union in Chernobyl, Ukraine, launched a plume of radioactive fallout that rendered a large swath of the region here uninhabitable. Since then, the creation of a 1,000-square-mile exclusion zone prohibiting human activity has led some to declare the area a restored Eden, brimming with wildlife. But for more than a decade, Timothy Mousseau, an American scientist, has conducted an extensive biological survey here, and his studies have shown that life has been far more slow to recover than previously believed.
It's a perfect area for biological studies because we see a diversity of plants and animals. It's one of the hotter areas in the Chernobyl zone, and so from our previous work we know that this level of chronic exposure is above that most species will tolerate.
Catching mice.
This year we've been looking at the small rodents, we've been looking at spiders. Earlier this year we were here working with the birds. We found that the abundance of many species of birds are depressed in these areas of high contamination, leading to an overall decrease in the biodiversity on the order of 50% fewer species in hot areas than there should be if there wasn't radioactivity in the area.
Mousseau says he has seen much higher frequencies of tumors and physical abnormalities, like deformed beaks among birds, compared with those from uncontaminated areas. He has measured declines in populations of insects and spiders, and yet in a recent paper released last month, Mousseau has also shown that some birds here may actually be adapting to high radiation levels.
So these are special digital audio recorders that are designed to pick up the high-frequency sounds that bats produce while they're echolocating, like flying around and trying to capture insects. And by the frequency of calls, we can get an idea of the abundance of bats. Yeah, look at these mushrooms here. See if it goes up. Oh, look at that, eh? 43. So 42, 43. So, yeah, this mushroom is definitely much hotter than the surrounding areas.
The legacy of Chernobyl, Mousseau says, can be seen not just in animal life. Cut trees here show a dramatic change in the color of their rings, exactly in 1986.
It occurred to us after visiting Fukushima last year that some of those spider webs looked a little strange. And so we thought we would test that hypothesis in a very scientific way by capturing images of as many spider webs as we can find in hot and cold areas of the same kinds of species, to see if there's more variability or less structure to the webs in these radioactive areas. It could serve as a biomarker of the background radiation. We're in the town of Chernobyl, downtown Chernobyl as it were, and what we found is that the frequency of aberrant color patterns on the backsides of these bugs is directly proportional to how radioactive the area is. The one on this side is relatively normal, and then you look on the other one and you see that the black spots are kind of fused together.
Thank you.
Mousseau's work in Chernobyl will continue for years to come. He's extended his study to Fukushima, Japan, and hopes to shed a brighter light on the lasting effects of radiation on biological systems, including humans.
There we go. I hope that came through okay. And let's get back to looking at the sort of the basic science here. That gives you a feel for what field work is like in the area. The first question for any kind of study of this sort is, how do you know how much radiation the animals are receiving? And this is important because without knowing this, then we can't relate the radiation directly to the effect. And the first step, of course, in determining these effects is to go out and catch the birds. And to do this, we actually put out about a third of a mile of nets. These are called mist nets. They're like fishermen's nets, except for birds and bats. And they're made of nylon that the birds can't see. And so if you put them along the edges of forests and meadows, the birds will fly into them. It doesn't hurt them at all. We don't hurt the birds in any way, but this allows us to capture them. And the toughest part is sometimes they get a little tangled up with their feet in the nets, as you can see in this little bird here. And but one of the greatest things about doing this kind of work is that it allows us to see up close and personal, as it were, some of the amazing critters that are out there. And I was going to try and show you an example of some of the animals we get. And let me just try playing one more little video here. We're testing this technology. This is one of my postdocs from Italy who's been working with us. We just caught
that's the fun part.
A little woodpecker. And he's trying to put a little...
barely a woodpecker.
I guess hopefully the audio's not too bad there. But trying to put a ring on it and do some basic measurements. Of course, the woodpecker's not being hurt in any way, but he is objecting a little bit to the handling. All right, let's see. Let's bring up another interesting critter we found. This was a juvenile owl.
Right.
Again, he was just sitting, he hadn't fledged yet, so he was just sitting around in one of the buildings, and actually went right up to him. He wasn't afraid of any people. He'd never seen people before, so he wasn't at all afraid. And so this was really, one of the wonderful parts about doing this kind of work is you get up close and personal. One of the things we've developed is actually a special little dosimeter. It's a little radiation detector that measures in the amounts of radiation the animals receive. We've developed these little dosimeters to put them on the bands of the birds, and they can fly around for a month or even a year with these little dosimeters, and we recapture them and we figure out that allows us to measure exactly how much radiation they get. We've actually started working with some rodents, voles and mice in particular, and come up with these little collars with the dosimeters on it. And this again allows us to determine exactly how much radiation they're experiencing. We just started a new project this last year in Japan with cows turns out many of the farmers did not want to kill their cows, and so they kept their cows going inside the exclusion zone. Some of them are living in very, very radioactive areas. And so we've teamed up with these farmers, put dosimeters on their ear tags, and actually take blood, and so we can start to look at how the cows are doing. And the cows are great. I don't know if many of you know about cows, but when you ring the dinner bell, the cows all come running, and so they're much easier to catch than the birds and the mice. Just got a question from Bridget about wearing protective clothing, and so in the areas of highest contamination, we do wear protective suits to keep the dust off our bodies, and we will wear gloves and masks. But it turns out, though, that the radiation that is in this area is mostly in the form of gamma radiation. It turns out gamma radiation can penetrate through 2 or 3 inches of lead without too much difficulty. And so there's really nothing you can wear to completely protect yourself from the radiation in the environment. So the best you can do is to try not to eat or breathe any of the particles of radioactive materials. And so we do try to minimize that kind of exposure. We also measure how much radiation is inside the bodies of these animals. This is a little lead cave in the back of a truck, and these bags hanging here contain a bird, and we put them inside this little cave without hurting them, and this allows us to measure how much radiation is inside their bodies. The cows, of course, you can't put a cow inside this little cave, and so with the cows we actually take a blood sample, and from that we can measure how much radiation is inside their bodies. And it turns out, though, that even a simple Geiger counter placed at the point of capture of the animals actually predicts very well what kind of radiation exposure the animals are getting. So this works pretty well. All right, so since this is a talk mostly about biodiversity, the first question we're going to attempt to address today is, so how many animals are there? Are they affected? Are the numbers of animals affected by the radiation in a given area? If you watch TV, read the newspapers, you might think that the abundance of animals should be higher inside these radioactive areas. And so that's the first question we were going to deal with. Got another question here from Donna. We're wondering if they have experimented with the effects of radiation on HeLa cells. I'm not sure, and that's out of my range of expertise. But let's stick here with the animal abundance for the moment. So one thing I want to point out before we get going is here's basically the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And the darker areas, like right here near the Chernobyl power plant, are the areas of highest radiation, whereas the green spots here on the map are absolutely clean. In fact, the radiation levels here are probably less than they are around Chicago, certainly less than what they are around New York City, just because the natural radioactivity in the soil of these areas is quite low. And so you see areas of very highly contaminated land and very clean land, even inside this exclusion zone. And when you go outside of the exclusion zone, you see the same kind of heterogeneity. This is one thing that this is really important, because what this does is it allows us to compare animals both inside the exclusion zone and outside of the exclusion zone in both radioactive areas and in clean areas. And so by comparing and contrasting hot and cold, inside and outside, we can start to get at some of these major questions of biodiversity. And we can do this at a regional scale or a landscape scale as well by looking at the effects in Belarus up here in the north and in Russia, though most of our work has been in Ukraine and Belarus. But we also have controlled populations in Italy, Spain, Denmark, and Ukraine. One of the next question down here from Bridget, is there any danger of these animals leaving the area and impacting other animals? And that's a really good question, because absolutely it's true that an awful lot of the birds in particular, they fly into the exclusion zone where it's very radioactive to come breed, where they migrate through on their way north or south in the spring or in the fall. And while they're in the zone, they pick up all this radioactive material and the food that they're eating and the water they're drinking. And so they carry it outside of the zone. And we actually did a study about 10 years ago estimating the amount of radioactivity that was dispersed in this way, and it's huge, large amounts. And of course, the animals also die in other places, and when they die, their bodies are radioactive. But more importantly, probably from a biological standpoint, is the fact that these animals, when they come into the zone and they accumulate mutations, as we'll see in a minute, they carry these mutations with them to the outside of the zone. And so if they encounter another population and there's breeding going on, mixing of the genomes, they will share these mutations that they picked up in Chernobyl with populations that are in clean areas. And so in this way, the negative mutational effects actually get dispersed beyond the boundaries of the exclusion zone. Just wanted to, one more video to show you how it is we actually count the birds. It's really very simple, very straightforward. Almost anybody can do it, and well, there's bird watchers around the world do this all the time. And this particular video is from Fukushima. And let me just turn off my microphone, but I want you to listen to this. Can you hear the bird singing? Place, and you know, the birds are singing. It's much like it would be anywhere in sort of temperate areas. And again, the biologists just basically have their binoculars, and they look for the birds that are moving around, and they listen to the birds that are singing. And most birds have a fairly distinctive song that allows you to identify them. And so what we do is we go to many places, both in Chernobyl and in Fukushima, and we basically count the numbers of each species of bird, and as well as the insects and other groups. In Fukushima, we've made 1,500 of these biotic inventories, is what we call them. In Chernobyl, we've made 896. And at each spot, we also measure everything else we possibly can about the environment. What's the weather like? What's the soil like? Is there water in the area? What's the vegetation like? All of these different factors that contribute to determining whether a bird is going to be found in a given spot. We also, of course, measure the radiation levels in the area. Then we use something called GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. And we put this into a multivariate statistical model. And from this, we can actually look at the effects of radiation on population abundance and biodiversity with a really high degree of sensitivity. To my knowledge, nobody has employed this kind of process for effects of pollution in this way, although it's been used to study effects of urbanization and other kinds of things, mostly in Europe. So using this approach allows us to get at this question of abundance and biodiversity. This slide is just to show you that we've been kind of busy. We've written quite a number of papers on this topic related to both Chernobyl and Fukushima in the last few years, and these are all published in first-tier scientific journals. So this is real. And the first result I want to show you is for Chernobyl birds here. And what this graph says, what this graph shows you, is that the total numbers, the abundance of birds, is dramatically depressed in areas of high contamination down at this end of the graph, whereas inside the zone, inside the exclusion zone, but where radioactivity is low, there's lots of birds. They seem to be doing just fine. So very strong effect of radiation here on the x-axis, whereas numbers of birds are shown at each one of these 896 points is shown here on the y-axis. So major impacts on abundance. What about numbers of species? Well, again, same basic effect. Again, this is for Chernobyl. There's perhaps half as many species in these areas of high contamination as there should be. They've disappeared, they've not come back. And remember, this is 25 years or so after the event for when these studies were conducted. But it's not just the birds. Again, one of the first things I noticed while we were doing work in this area was, normally when you're walking through the forest, you've got to continuously clear the cobwebs from your face. And one of the things I noticed was that I didn't have to do this in Chernobyl. And so we started counting the numbers of spiders along these transects. And oh my goodness, the spiders, again, almost no spiders in these areas of high contamination, whereas normal numbers of spiders up here where there was no radiation inside the zone. But it's not just spiders and birds, but again, grasshoppers show significant declines in areas of high contamination. Dragonflies, there are many fewer dragonflies in areas of high radiation. Bumblebees. It's funny, I guess about 10 years ago, I decided, being an entomologist and a geneticist, I decided I had to do some work with fruit flies. So I went to Chernobyl to go collect fruit flies, and I couldn't find any, very few. And then I realized all these fruit trees that were in the area, and there are fruit trees all over the place, most of these fruit trees had very few fruit, and so there was very little rotting fruit on the ground, and as a consequence, very few fruit flies. And then I looked around and realized there were very few bees and butterflies, the insects that would normally pollinate these fruit plants to generate the fruit. And without them, the fruit trees produce very few fruit. And after we started counting them in a rigorous way, we realized, indeed, the bees were at much lower numbers. The butterflies were almost completely gone in areas of high contamination. And but of course, one of the issues, the questions that everybody has is, what about the mammals? Humans, we're mammals. It's interesting that the birds and the bees are affected, but maybe that's not so important compared to what affects the mammals. And so it took us a while to figure out a way to estimate the mammal abundance and biodiversity in an easy and quick way. And then it dawned on us, let's go back in the wintertime, and after a fresh snowfall, we can do transects. We can walk along the roadsides and look for footprints in the snow, in the fresh snow. And so we started to do this to count all the mammals. And here's one of the mammals we encountered. Anybody out there have a guess as to what kind of footprint this might be here? And again, you can see the ruler at the top here. You can see how big this footprint is. Anybody? Anybody? Excuse me. No, I'll let you in. This one is a wolf. And yes, indeed, there are wolves and dog-wolf hybrids inside the Chernobyl zone. And this was kind of interesting to see these wolves that we never actually see in plain sight, but are certainly there. But anyway, when we do the counts for the mammals, we find the same basic effect. The mammal numbers are dramatically lower in the areas of high contamination. Here's another study we did for the mice and the small rodents in the area. And again, very few found in areas of high radiation. Almost none, actually, about 10 microsieverts per hour. And we keep finding the same basic effects all over the zone. So that's the Chernobyl zone. Let's see, let's move on. So basically, what we found is that the abundances and diversity are high in clean parts of the zone, but are dramatically lower in the more radioactive regions. So all these TV shows about how things are thriving, that's just pure TV. That's mythology. Deb asked me if we've done any botanical studies, and we certainly have, and we published a few papers, but can't get to everything in 1 hour. So if we get a chance, I'll mention some of the botanical studies, which also show significant effects. But what about Fukushima? What about the disaster in Japan? Again, much more recent. It only occurred 3 years ago, and it's a little bit smaller area. And so again, to test the same ideas, we went to Japan starting in 2011, and we've been there every year since. Again, counting the birds and the insects. These little squiggles on the map show the areas that we've looked at very carefully, in areas of very high contamination, in areas that are relatively clean. Although I have to say it's hard to find areas that are completely clean in Japan. Overall, what we found is that in Fukushima, following the first year, we see major effects on the birds and the butterflies, and a little bit of effect on the cicadas, those noisy insects that are out in the fall, but no effects on grasshoppers, bees, or dragonflies. And in fact, the spiders actually went up in number in the first summer following the disaster in Fukushima. Anybody have any idea why the spiders might have gone up and not been affected the way they were in Chernobyl? Yep, you got to be quicker on the keyboard. But anyway, the answer is, of course, probably it was because there aren't any birds around in these areas of high contamination. And actually, these data right here, we just finished these. We just did the last surveys in July 2014. And when you look at the total numbers of birds in Fukushima, this graph shows you that, again, very few in the areas of high contamination, whereas in the cleaner parts of the zone, relatively normal numbers of birds. And the results for biodiversity are even stronger. Again, biodiversity drops off dramatically in these areas of high contamination. So we're seeing the same basic effects in Fukushima as we've seen in Chernobyl. So major consequences. And let's see, I guess I have a little bit of time here. Let me bring up a video player again of what it looks and sounds like in these areas of high contamination. Hear anything? Did you see any insects flying around? No, these areas of high contamination are silent. Many of you may have heard of the very well-known book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring that reflected the impacts on birds as a result of pesticide use in the 60s and 70s. We're seeing the same kinds of phenomena in the birds in the highly radioactive areas. So radiation depresses abundance and diversity of most taxa in Chernobyl, depresses birds, butterflies, and cicadas in Fukushima in the first year, and now we're seeing that the effects are likely to increase over time. But again, we need to study this. So I guess 10:45 or 9:45 your time. Deb, should I stop here, or should I go into some of the other kinds of traits we're going that we've been finding? I've got lots of slides of the kinds of mutations that occur and show up, but I'd certainly want to leave enough time for questions and answers if people have them. What do you think, Deb? Nope, no answer. Well, I'll continue a little bit, and you just stop me if you need to. So the next question is, really, why are the numbers of animals dropping off? What's the cause of this? And of course, our hypothesis is that it relates to genetic damage caused by the radiation. And so to get at this, we've developed a number of different techniques to look at this. The simplest one we're using is something we call a comet assay. And basically, we take individual cells and we look at the nuclei of these individual cells from a variety of different animals and different cell types, and we look at it under the microscope. And basically, what we can see is whether or not there's whether or not the chromosomes have been broken up as a result of the radiation. And what we find pretty much universally is that in areas that are clean, like this one right here, the nucleus is intact, the DNA is all sort of stuck in the nucleus. But when we look at areas of high contamination, we see these what we call long comet tails These are all the fragments of DNA that have been caused by the radiation. And again, almost all of the critters we've looked at show the same kind of pattern. So the radiation is causing genetic damage. Deb asked, are we seeing food web collapse in these areas? And there certainly is indication of a major collapse of the ecosystem in these areas of highest contamination. And I'll show you maybe a little bit of evidence for broader ecosystem effects in a second. We can use, again, this kind of approach, these common assays for all sorts of critters. And again, over and over again, we see that genetic damage does result from radiation exposure. Luckily, we have robotic microscopes that help us scan lots and lots of cells from lots and lots of critters. And again, it's very, very rigorous and conclusive. Since I'm running a little short on time, I'm going to skip the video of collecting sperm from birds and just tell you that we've developed a method to non-destructively, without hurting the birds, acquire some of their reproductive materials. These are the genes that are passed on to the next generation. The sperm and the egg come together, of course, to form the embryo, the zygote, the embryo. By looking at sperm, we have a better idea of what genetic effects might be passed to the next generation. And when we look at deformities in the sperm, again, we see major deformities in many of these birds. This is a graph showing that in some birds, barred swallows in radioactive areas, up to 40% of the sperm are abnormal and thus not particularly useful to do their job. And so, again, this is one indication of why abundances might be going down. We recently published a study showing that for 10 different species of birds, when we look at these 10 species of birds, compare individuals from Europe versus individuals in Chernobyl, we see that the Chernobyl birds have much higher levels of abnormalities in the sperm for 9 out of the 10 species of birds. Now, one species right here, the species doesn't seem to be affected by the radiation. And again, that's another one of our conclusions, really, that there's a lot of variability among species, and that some species actually seem to be adapting to the area. Another aspect of fertility concerns male sterility. Again, it's been well known from medical studies that, for instance, people undergoing radiation therapy, men undergoing radiation therapy, are told to bank their sperm if they're thinking of having children later in life. And the reason is that radiation is known to cause sterility. Well, we see the same thing in the birds. In the areas of high contamination in Chernobyl, up to 40% of the birds are completely sterile. They're incapable of siring offspring. And again, this could be one of the reasons why the birds are disappearing. You're seeing the same basic effects in the small rodents of Chernobyl as well. So again, big effects on fertility as a result of that. We see, again, patches of white feathers popping up here and there in a large number of different species of birds. Let's see here. This is just, again, we call these partial albinos, but it's really, the partial albinos probably don't have a major effect on survival, but they are a reflection of genetic damage to the tissues. And they're popping up in a wide variety of species. And we're actually starting to see these partial albinos popping up in Fukushima as well, which again suggests that the radiation is having a similar effect in Fukushima as what we've found in Chernobyl. And they're popping up all over the place in these contaminated areas. Some of you who've been following the Fukushima disaster may have heard about the cows. Again, one of the reasons we started working with the cows is that some of these cows also are showing these white spots. I apologize for showing you the rear end of a cow. Anyway, again, nobody knows what's causing these white spots, but we think it could have something to do with the radiation in the area, just as we've seen with the birds. Tumors, again, we always think about cancers and tumors as a result of radiation. And once again, when we look at the birds very carefully, we see evidence of many individuals showing these kinds of tumors, particularly on their heads. And again, this is not good for a bird. It's unlikely to survive very long with this kind of tumorous growth on their bodies. You know, after the atomic bombs were dropped in Japan, it was noticed that many of the survivors started to show cataracts in their eyes, this opacity in the lens of the eye that keeps one from seeing. And so we started to look at the birds in Chernobyl, and actually been also seen in children living in Ukraine and Belarus in the Chernobyl affected areas as well. And so we started looking at the birds, and much to our surprise, again, many of the birds in the radioactive areas show higher frequencies of these cataracts, which again are rarely seen in natural populations in other parts of the world. You know, obviously a bird that can't see is likely to not survive very, very long. So again, likely fitness consequences. This is just a graph again showing that the prevalence of these cataracts and the intensity of the cataracts are much higher in the more radioactive areas than in the clean areas. We actually started looking at the mice in Chernobyl as well, looking at their eyes, and lo and behold, again, we're seeing cataracts in the mice as well, that, again, never seen before in other areas, and a very strong relationship for the females with radiation, but not with the males. Again, some evidence of variability and sensitivity to the radiation. Another characteristic, again, that affects me personally, I think, the birds of Chernobyl have smaller brains, and I'm starting to wonder if my own brain isn't shrinking a little as a result of all this radiation I've been experiencing. Some days I certainly feel like it. This is important to these birds because actually we've also learned that the probability of survival from 1 year to the next is dramatically lower for the birds with smaller brains. It's only the birds with larger brains where they have a much higher probability of surviving from 1 year to the next. Let's see. And again, looking at the mice, we see the same basic effect on neurological development on the mice, smaller brains in the more radioactive areas of both Chernobyl and also in Fukushima. And actually this graph just puts all of it together. And again, lots of noise, of course, around these relationships reflecting individual variability, but overall the pattern is very convincing. There's a big effects on neurological development reflected in brain size in both the birds and the small mammals. It's not just the birds and the mammals, but also the insects. This is one of my favorite examples. It really clearly illustrates the effects of the radiation. This is a firebug. It occurs in many parts of the world. I like to call it the face mask bug because if you sort of ignore the antenna and the legs, can you see this face mask here? The two eyes, you know, there's the eyes up here and the nose in the middle, the mouth at the bottom, forehead. This is a normal looking one here. And if you go to Chernobyl, and I guess it was in the New York video, the New York Times video, they showed some examples, but here are some other examples, again, of the kinds of deformities we see in this face mask pattern as a result of radiation exposure. Again, it's pretty overwhelming. Butterflies in Fukushima, a number of papers published recently, and again, showing a wide range of developmental abnormalities and deformities. But, you know, again, we could go on and on. The trees, here's an example from trees. These are pine trees in Chernobyl, again, affected by the radiation. You see their growth form is dramatically affected. They should be tall and straight like normal pine trees, but they show all sorts of strange growth abnormalities. You know, the quality and density of the wood is also affected. So this is probably important from an ecosystem perspective as well. Growth rates are affected, especially in years of drought. The red bars here again show the effects of radiation on depressed growth in the pine trees in the area, published last year, and appropriately enough in a journal called Trees. One final observation, since we're running just about out of time here. Again, during our early days visiting Chernobyl, we noticed that as we were walking through some of the more radioactive areas, we'd see all these dead trees on the ground, and all these tree trunks were 20 years old, and they were basically solid. They hadn't decomposed, and so this led us to hypothesize that the decomposers, the bacteria, the fungi, and the insects in the area, were affected by the radiation and leading to reduced levels of decomposition and thus nutrient recycling in the ecosystem. So we did an experiment where we put out large numbers of bags of leaves into different parts of the zone, about 600 of these bags, with different kinds of plant material inside them. And again, the basic result is that decomposition, the nutrient recycling effects are dramatically reduced in these areas of high radiation, less than 50% of the decomposition activity going on. So I think, let me just end there then, since we pretty much run out of time. And the basic conclusions are that, oh my goodness, everything we've looked at basically shows consequences of this radiation, that in the areas of high radiation, biodiversity, abundances are reduced, there's higher mutation rates, there's lower fertility rates, there's genetic damage, and so all of these effects add up to ecosystem effects in these most contaminated areas. There is some good news in that in some parts of the area zone, some of the individual species that we see do show some signs of adaptation. In other words, they seem to be tolerating the radiation better than they used to 20 generations earlier. And that's where we're going to be focusing a lot of our research in the coming years, we hope. So let me just end there and by thanking you all for attending. It's been a great experience. Thank you, Deb, again. And any of you who are interested in knowing more can go to our website. We have lots of publications, photos, and other things. So I guess I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but I'm certainly available to answer any that you might have. Thank you very much. I can't hear the clapping. Yeah, very good. Thanks for the clap. What is my education background? I have a bachelor's in biology and a master's in zoology and a PhD in population biology from McGill University. And then I went and did a postdoctoral, sort of a postdoctoral residency at the University of California, Davis before moving to the University of South Carolina to become a professor. Can the radiation problem be solved? And of course, the main solution to such problems is to avoid them from occurring in the first place. And so we certainly need to make it much less likely for these kinds of disasters to occur in the future by improving the technology as much as possible. Are there scientists doing similar research? There's a few scientists working with us in Japan, Japanese scientists working on other bird species, on other insects. In Ukraine, there have been quite a number of scientists, but most of them have not been publishing in English, so you don't hear about their work. We have a group from Finland who are our main partners in the research on rodents. So yes, we have many other scientists working with us, but not as many as you'd think, given the size of the problem. What are the spiders eating if the insect populations are so depressed? That's a good question. And so we haven't counted the numbers of mosquitoes, and it's clear that some of the insects don't seem to be that affected by the radiation, and mosquitoes seem to be one group that don't seem to be affected. And in fact, actually, even some of the insects that are there, like the dragonflies in Fukushima, are not nearly as affected. They seem to be flying a little slower, and so maybe they're easier to catch. And so maybe the spiders are able to find more food again as a result of the slower and less capable insects that fly into their nets, or their webs, I mean. Oh, is it easy to get published? And how much radiation am I being exposed to? Yeah, so no, it's never easy to get published. You know, again, the publication in publishing in scientific journals is incredibly difficult because it's reviewed by other scientists who are incredibly critical. And so if there's any problem at all, you'll hear about it, and they won't publish the papers if there's any issues at all. So you know, again, the first cut in credibility in any kind of scientific discussion requires that the data be published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and this is what we try to do. And like I said, we have about 65 papers now on this topic. How much radiation are we getting? Well, yeah, we didn't, you know, before we got into this, we didn't worry so much about the radiation exposure because, you know, everybody told us that it was fine, there wasn't a big problem. But now we're paying much closer attention and measuring our exposures, and it's clear that there are likely to be some consequences. We're hoping that we're among the more resistant individuals in the population. That's one of the things about these kinds of studies. What we find is that there's tremendous variation among individuals and their sensitivity. Some people get sick, some people get cancers, others don't. And you've all heard the stories. And so if you're unlucky, you win this unlucky lottery, and you get sick in some way as a result of small levels of exposure, whereas other individuals are quite tolerant. So we're trying to be careful, and you know, hopefully, you know, I keep thinking that I'll probably be affected by something other than the radiation before the radiation comes back to haunt me. Do you need any teacher assistance for future adventures? Well, one of the issues, of course, is, again, it's related to the radiation exposure. One of the, you know, we have these moral dilemmas related to, you know, how many people do we bring with us, and you know, given that there are some risks involved, we've tried not to bring young people. In fact, young people are not allowed into the Chernobyl zone for these reasons. The other challenge is that the work is incredibly the work is incredibly expensive. You know, going to Chernobyl, you know, it costs a lot of money, and to do this kind of research, Fukushima is even more expensive because it's in Japan, and so one of the challenges we face is finding the funding to do this kind of research. And so yeah, I guess at some point, if we were to get a grant that would allow us to cover the costs and of everything, then there's some chance we could bring some more people. But the other issue is accommodations. There's really not a lot of, there really isn't much in the way of a tourism business, despite some of the press coverage of tourists going to Chernobyl. There's really only room for a dozen or so people, and so there are these issues as well. But yeah, you probably should think about bringing some teachers with us. At the moment, I'm trying to bring more researchers to you know, expand the range of organisms that we're able to study, and get more data on these questions. You can never have too many data. Well, thank you very much. I just got back from Fukushima yesterday, and actually the day before yesterday, and today I'm heading back to Chernobyl. So I actually have to go give a lecture to my class, and then hop a plane to Ukraine later this afternoon. So thank you so much again for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and I wish you all the best. And I guess with that, I'll say sayonara. Thanks very much. Okay, let's see. All right, bye, Deb. Thanks again.